All right. So assuming that's okay, there was a little bit of a confusion, unfortunately, about the topic for this evening. So my apologies to Pat especially, who had reached out originally to start this session or to get this whole ball rolling. And we talked about kind of a timely topic of getting your bees ready for winter. I then neglected to remember that, and I sent out some emails inviting and reminding people to join this as just kind of a general NC State update. So I was able to put this together. There are some updates of some things going on at NC State here at the end that we'll get to. But for tonight, we'll just talk about getting your bees ready for the winter. And again, we may be a little bit late in the season right now, given the cold weather, early cold weather that we've been having. But this is a general discussion about how really to prepare your bees going into winter, and really that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So some of the topics that we're going to be covering is kind of the preparation issues, both of what you can do to your beehives as well as how you can rearrange your beehives. And then we'll talk about some final considerations that you may want to think about in order to really optimize your preparation for winter. Now, by far, the #1 thing to prepare your bees for winter is to keep Varroa mites under control. And we're, again, a little bit late in the season right now for how to prepare for Varroa mites. This in and of itself is a hugely important topic and something that deserves its own multi-hour discussion. But just very briefly to go over some of the important aspects of Varroa mites. This is kind of public enemy #1 when it comes to beekeepers. Those foundress mites go into brood cells that are just about to pupate, and then once the brood is sealed, then the mite is able to reproduce and make many daughter mites, which then emerge on the adult workers. The workers emerge kind of sickly, and they don't live as long, and they're not going to be nearly as productive for the colony. And so without some sort of intervention or beekeeper maintenance of Varroa mites, colonies can very, very quickly dwindle. It's been said that it's not Varroa mites that kill your colony, it's the diseases that they vector that end up killing your colony. And actually both is true when we're talking about the kind of pre-winter parasitism of bees. The viruses that the mites vector, they transmit it horizontally among the different workers and within the brood. But also if you have a queen that's infected with these viruses, then she can transmit it vertically down to her offspring. So it's really, really important to make sure that these entire pathogen webs are kind of kept at bay. And the only way that we can do so is to keep the Varroa mite vector from really getting out of hand. One of the main calling cards of Varroa mite pathogen spread is this virus called the deformed wing virus, where you see the bees with these very crinkled or shrunken wings, where they're not able to fly at all. Clearly, those types of workers are not going to be able to provide as much work towards the colony, and colonies can succumb to this quite readily. This is very, very highly prevalent. It can be very, very problematic. And again, this is not caused by the Varroa directly. It's caused by a virus that the Varroa vectors. And so it's really critical to keep Varroa and these viruses in check. The thing to remember, however, is that in order to keep the Varroa under control, you need to constantly monitor for how many Varroa you have in your colony. And it's a very common thing of people using sticky boards in order to determine that. And these are really helpful and useful in the sense that they're very quick and easy and minimally disruptive to the colony. but they're not very accurate. So we're really trying to move away from assessing how many Varroa you have in your colony using sticky boards. These are helpful during the winter time, but only for a qualitative assessment, not a quantitative one. That is, these are helpful to determine if you have a lot of mites or very few mites in kind of a general idea of how many mites you have, but not a very precise measure. And so these can be helpful in kind of a passive way to keep an idea of how many mites you have. But because measuring mites using a sticky board is completely confounded by how big the colony is, that is, a bigger colony is just naturally going to have more mites in it. It's kind of hard to come down with economic thresholds or very precise advice about what you need to do. Instead, in the late summer and in the fall, throughout the fall, you want to routinely monitor your colonies using a sugar shake, which is a much more accurate way to measure the percentage of mites in your bees. And that's really the way to monitor how many mites you have. And the idea is you take a known quantity, it's actually really more like 300 adult bees and a half a cup of bees that you scoop out from the brood nest. Don't sample the queen because you know, you don't want to hurt her in doing this. Put it in a mason jar with a screened lid. Place a couple tablespoons of powdered sugar into there and make sure all the bees get coated with the sugar, and then vigorously shake the jar inverted onto a white piece of paper or some other surface where you can see the mites fall out with all the excess sugar, but the bees stay inside. And then you count the number of mites, divide by the number of bees, and then you can get a percentage of mite prevalence within the colony. Now, what's kind of shocking about this is that the percentage of mites that result in severe damage of your colony is extremely low. And it's been getting lower and lower over the years as the mites have become kind of more and more virulent, and the viruses that they're vectoring become more problematic and become more virulent themselves. So at the peak population, or at the population decrease, which is when you're going into winter, if you have 3% or more mites in your sugar shake, your bees are in terrible danger, and they're probably going to die through the winter if you don't do anything. That's a very low percentage. Most people don't think of even looking for Varroa mites until they start seeing them. Well, I can tell you that once you start seeing the Varroa mites on the bees in your colony, your bees are probably already dead. So you really, really need to be proactive when it comes to Varroa mites. This table comes from this free handout, this free pamphlet created by the Honeybee Health Coalition that you can find very readily online. And it just tells you what those kind of treatment thresholds are, or control thresholds, where you need to take action. It's a lot lower than most people think. So going into winter, it's incredibly important to have the mite population known within your colonies. This is especially true because in the fall, that's when the winter bees are being reared by the colony. The winter bees are the ones that have a lot of fat stores and other physiological changes to them. So rather than living for 6 weeks like they do in the summer, they can live up to 6 months during the winter. And so if those special long-lived winter bees get parasitized in the fall, then they're not going to live as long during the winter, and therefore the colony is going to die out before next spring. So it is really, really critical to make sure that when the colony is rearing those winter bees, that the mite parasitism is as low as possible. So to summarize that aspect, I just can't underscore the importance of being proactive and keeping the mite levels low to reduce winter mortality, because Varroa mites are the primary cause of that winter mortality. And if you don't have good records, if you don't have good numbers of your mites going into winter, then you're really rolling the dice, and it's a very high risk that your colonies aren't going to make it. Proper control of those mites is the best predictor of your overwintering success. And so monitoring those mite levels, and then making sure, especially those winter bees, are not parasitized so that they can live all through the winter and start rearing brood the next spring so that the colony can make it through the winter. So I'll get off my high horse and my soapbox when it comes to Varroa mites there, but let's talk about some other things that you can do during the late summer and early fall in getting your bees ready for winter, and that is supplemental feeding. I think, before winter, when it's still warm out, a lot of places here in North Carolina don't necessarily have a great fall nectar flow, in which case providing some supplemental sugar syrup is really helpful. These front feeders aren't really the best for that. Usually these top hive feeders or some inverted buckets or even division board feeders that take place of a frame inside a colony, those tend to be a lot more useful for bees in the late fall to take a thick sugar syrup, so that is kind of 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, so they have the least amount of drying out of that syrup in order to incorporate that into their honey stores. Now, you definitely don't want to do this during the honey flow season, right? The bees would rather them make their own honey from natural sources. But if they seem a little bit light going into winter, you can really put the feed on them, make it really thick, and feed it to them, and they will store it into the combs, and they will use that for their winter stores in order to stay warm. Now, there's a lot of debates about what kind of sugar you can use. By and large, the best sugar that you can provide them is the honey that they make themselves, right? So a lot of times, overwintering losses can be predicated by the fact that the beekeeper took way too much honey off of the colony in the first place. So err on the side of being conservative about how much honey you take off, and allow that honey to be there for them so that they can make it through the winter. Sucrose is the most common form of sugar in most nectars, and therefore that is kind of the most common form of sugar that beekeepers like to mix up, especially kind of smaller scale beekeepers. The problem is that this needs to be kind of chemically converted and changed by the bees, and they also need to dry it out quite a bit, so they need to evaporate the water, which can be difficult to do when it's fairly cold outside. And it can be costly to mix up and hard to store, so there are pros and cons to sugar, to sucrose. A lot of commercial beekeepers use high fructose corn syrup, which is kind of already in a liquid form. It's less prone to spoilage and other types of sugar, but it does have its own problems, especially prone to crystallization and production of HMF, which is a kind of a toxin that can result from overheating it. There are commercial types of different sugar supplements that I won't necessarily go into, but again, they all have their pros and cons. But one thing to underscore here is that molasses or any caramelized sugar should never be fed to your bees, because that can actually cause dysentery in your bees and be very, very problematic for them. So this is another reason why you also don't want to take crystallized or otherwise sugar syrup and heat it up on the stove. And if it overheats on the stove, then those sugars can crystallize and again caramelize and make the bees sick. So be very careful about molasses or other forms of sugar that way. Now, that's again going into winter is when you want to kind of push and feed a very thick sugar syrup just so that they can make sure that they have enough honey stores going into winter. But you never want to feed liquid sugar during the winter itself. When the bees are in the winter and they're clustered inside the hive, they're not going to break cluster and be able to go up into the liquid sugar and drink it down, put it into the combs, and dry it out. When they're clustering, that's just not a time when they're going to be ripening sugar or ripening syrup. So really leaving enough honey stores and going into winter with enough honey is really the best thing to do. But if you need to supplementally feed carbohydrate during the winter, providing fondant on the top, in between the lid and the inner cover is often the best way to do that. Fondant, of course, is the kind of hard sugar candy, the queen candy, right, that you get in the cages when you buy queens through the mail. You can mix that up yourself by just simply mixing corn syrup and powdered sugar together until it's practically rock hard. That can then be slowly consumed by the bees for sustenance, not really for generating heat or creating heat. So that's kind of a last-ditch situation if you need to feed during the cold months of the winter. Now, as often and as frequent as beekeepers feed sugar syrup to their bees, often too much at times that can cause them to swarm in the spring and other problems. The feeding of protein, supplemental protein, is often neglected. And this is something that beekeepers really, I think, especially smaller scale beekeepers, could really benefit from by making sure that the colonies have enough protein, particularly at different times of year when it can be helpful. Going into winter can be one of those times if the colony is not collecting enough pollen or they don't have sufficient pollen stores inside the combs. Those winter bees, again, those precious winter bees that make it through the winter and live several months rather than several weeks, they need to be raised on a really good high protein diet, and so that their fat stores and their protein stores are sufficient. So feeding protein going into winter can be really, really helpful. Now, not just for the winter bees and their fat bodies and their fat stores, but they tap into the following spring. Those winter bees revert back to being nurses, and then their hypopharyngeal glands, which are these kind of bulbous glands, they look like bunches of grapes that's inside the cavity of their head. Those things swell up with the brood food, and that's fed to the larvae early in the spring. So the colony can only go into winter with so many kind of food stores or pollen stores. And so a lot of the brood food that's produced next spring by these older winter bees is stored in their body. And the only way they get it into their body is by being fed when they're being developed during the fall. So thinking well ahead to next spring, this past fall, is really, really critical. And providing supplemental protein can be really helpful in that endeavor. Now, I make the distinction here between pollen supplement and pollen substitute. And really the distinction here is that pollen supplement contains mostly real pollen, corbicular pollen that was collected either by you or another beekeeper kind of the spring before and then stored in the freezer until you need it later on in the year. Pollen substitute are non-pollen sources such as soy flour or brewer's yeast that can be cheaper. A lot of larger scale beekeepers mix up large batches of pollen substitute and provide it to their bees. And again, it provides a protein source, but it's not kind of the fully natural diet that the bees are used to. And therefore, it may have some shortcomings on some of the micronutrients that they have. bee bread is, you know, the stored pollen, and this is by far the most nutrient-rich form of protein that bees will have. So if a colony goes into winter with many frames of bee bread, that is stored pollen in the combs, this is the best food that they can then tap into the following spring, or to raise those winter bees going into winter, so that they have all the adequate resources that they need. So again, there's another free manuscript online called Fat Bees, Skinny Bees, which is something that I encourage all beekeepers to have on hand to talk about supplemental feeding, both of carbohydrate and of protein. But that proper nutrition is really, really important, especially going into winter, for the protein of those winter bees that need to live for many months throughout the winter. The timing of that, therefore, can be really important. And you also want to think ahead well enough so that you're not waiting to the last minute after the winter bees have already been raised. Okay. So those are some of the kind of management things that you need to do kind of in the fall time. But right before winter, just as you're really getting ready for winter, the reorganization of the hive itself is really important. So I want to underscore this concept of the colony versus the hive. So the hive is nothing more than just the house, right? That's the box that we provide them. That's the house in which the bees live. The colony is the bees and the honey and the brood and the stored food and everything else, right? So the colony swarms, the hive doesn't swarm, right? The hive is something that we have control over. The colony is what the bees we're trying to help them make the best colony they can. So really, a lot of what beekeeping is this ratio between the hive size and the colony size. And you always want the hive to mirror or to facilitate the colony itself. And you want to account for colony growth, or going into winter, colony contraction, so that the hive is not appropriate for the size of the colony. In other words, as the colony is brooding down going into winter, you want to be taking off extra hive bodies so that they don't have extra room to heat, right? So in other words, as you're going into winter, you want to arrange your boxes, and you want to make sure that the bees, the colony inside the hive, is appropriate. So for example, over here on the left, you have a double deep where you have the, the bees and the brood and the cluster down here surrounded by honey, but they have a second super that's completely empty. That's not very good, because that's just extra space that they're going to have to heat, and that's a problem. The same is true, the opposite of that, where the bees are upstairs and they just have an empty bottom box. Again, that's just empty space that they don't really need. Another one is if you try to overwinter with honey supers, especially empty honey supers, that's not really going to work. And you don't want to have a split brood nest either. You want to make sure that the bees are all clustered together and not separate, so that they can have that critical size of the cluster into winter. So in essence, what you as the beekeeper can do in order to help the bees maximize their success going into winter, and to predict what the bees are going to need, is you take off those extra boxes and knock them from 2 stories down into 1 story. Or you take off those extra supers and you rearrange the frames, so that what you really want is the cluster and the bees mainly to be on the bottom, and then the honey is over top. The reason why it's important for the honey to be over top of the cluster going into winter is because before winter, as they go into winter, they will eat the honey downstairs first, and they will slowly move through all the frames in the first story. And then they'll move up because hot air rises, the cluster will move up into that second box. So then coming out of winter, that first story is then empty, whereas that second story is where the cluster is with still any remaining honey up there. So you don't want to start with the cluster upstairs because then they have nowhere to go. You want the bees to start down below and to work their way up into stored honey that they can uncap and consume during the winter months. So that's the best way to have the hive fashioned appropriately for the colony so that they have the best chance of making it through the winter. Now, it's important to remember during the winter, you never go inside the colony. As long as they're clustered, as long as they're staying inside, you never want to break the seals of all the different propolis seals that they had to keep the inside of the hive nice and warm. But they cluster nice and tightly inside the hive. And they start doing so at actually a pretty high temperature, at least what we would still consider nice and balmy at 64 degrees. That's cold to the bees who like their brood nest temperature at least at 95 degrees, right? But once it starts to get into the 60s and then 50s, that's when they really start, raising more brood. They start to cluster and retain heat. They stop foraging at 50 degrees when it's 50 degrees outside. And they get more and more dense as a cluster as it drops from in the 50s down into the teens. Once it gets to 14 degrees, they can't cluster any more tightly. They can't retain their heat anymore by huddling together and keeping each other warm. At that point, that's when they need to start exercising their wing motor muscles to generate heat so that they stay, the inside of that cluster stays at about 50 degrees, 45 to 50 degrees all throughout the winter. Now the outside of the cluster tends to get a little bit cooler, so those bees move inside to the cluster, forcing the ones inside back outside. So they're constantly moving around in the cluster all winter long, but they're either retaining the heat or they're generating the heat using the honey stores in order to do that. So this is a thermal heat picture of the cluster inside the hive. And what you can see from this is that, again, the cluster is centered inside the colony, and they keep it warm compared to the periphery, but the hot air rises, and so this is why they're much more prone to move up into the nest to consume the honey above them rather than down and to the sides, right? So that's why you need to put the cluster in the bottom box going into winter so that they have all the opportunity to go up. Now, another thing, some of you probably don't use queen excluders. Some of you may, but no matter what, even if you do use queen excluders, you always want to remove queen excluders when you're going into winter, right? So you never go into winter with a queen excluder, especially if there's honey above the brood nest or above the cluster, so that as they move up, the queen gets left behind and then she gets chilled and dies. So you always want to take off the excluders if you happen to have them on going into winter. Some other things to do, however, preparing your hives, is you want to reduce the entrance, right? Rather than having a very large exposed entrance that is helpful for lots of foraging activity, when the bees are in cluster and they're not foraging very much, using those entrance reducers is really helpful. There's different types of them. Some of them have these multiple holes like this. Others are these wooden blocks that are pretty standard. One thing that I like to do with these wooden blocks is, rather than have the little notch on the bottom, I like to flip it up so that the notch is actually a little bit on the top, because what happens sometimes is that as bees die in the winter, and during some warmer winter days, the bees can often start carrying the dead corpses out the front, but then they pile up right here, and so then they can get frozen right there and then block up the entrance entirely. But if you put it where it's just the notch goes on the top rather than on the bottom, then as they pile up, they're going to be piled up on the floor, and they'll still be able to get outside. Anyway, reducing the entrance is really helpful. It also helps keep other critters out that like a nice warm spot for the winter, such as mice, which can often build nests and whatnot in the entrance of beehives. One last change and thing that you can consider, and that can be very, very helpful for overwintering colonies, is for ventilation. And so a lot of the inner covers that you see have these notches in the back, right? And so placing that notch, flipping that inner cover upside down so that the notch is down below rather than up top, is something that you can do that allows just a little bit of hot air to escape. Now, you don't want all the hot air to escape, so there's an optimum level. You don't want too much ventilation where they can't stay warm, but you don't want too little ventilation either, because then you can get condensation building up inside the hive that can be very, very problematic. If the condensation gets all over the honey and then it freezes again, now you have ice crystals inside the hive, and that can just spell disaster for the cluster as it's trying to move through the combs. So you want to have a little bit of ventilation so that hot, moist air can escape, but not too much heat where it's going to be hard for them to make it through the winter. Now, I'm going to try something here. I'm going to try a polling question. I'm going to ask, for those of you who are on individually, would like for you to answer the question of whether or not you wrap your hives during the winter. So this is something that, for those of you that have never seen this, there is a practice where beekeepers can take tar paper or other insulary covers and wrap the hives so that they stay nice and warm. Oh, that was great. Lots of people answered that. Thank you. I'm sharing the results. Nobody wraps their hives. And that is a very good answer to that question, because down here, we don't really have prolonged winters that are just so super cold where it's really, really needed. In places where it's really prolonged and very, very cold winters, that can help. But we're talking, you know, kind of northern Minnesota or Canada or places where there's kind of 5-6 months of winter where the bees really need every benefit that they can get in order to keep their temperature optimum. But down here, wrapping them really is counterintuitively bad, because that can help prevent that ventilation of moist air. And so wrapping often causes more harm than it helps. So again, in North Carolina, or at least in most places in North Carolina, this is not something that most beekeepers really need to worry about. So good on you guys for A, doing the poll correctly, and B, answering correctly. Okay, so to summarize that section, kind of reducing the size of the hive to make it appropriate for the colony is really critical. If the colony is large enough, then you can overwinter with 2 brood boxes. But if it's not big enough to overwinter in 2 brood boxes, it is perfectly fine to overwinter in 1. Just make sure that they have sufficient honey above the cluster whenever you're knocking them down into a smaller hive. It's a lot easier to heat a smaller space than it is a larger one. Proper positioning of that cluster with sufficient honey stores above is really the best way to promote the good thermodynamics for that cluster throughout the winter dearth. And never overwinter with clusters. Make sure you reduce the entrance and have a small ventilation hole on the top of the hive to promote good airflow and ventilation. Okay, so for some last considerations here, we'll just go through a couple things to think about. At least you don't necessarily have to do these things, but it's something that can help make or break whether you have good overwintering success or not. The first is really how many hives you have at a particular location and where that location is. We don't all have infinite number of choices of where we're able to place our bees. There isn't really a single apiary that is ideal. There are lots of different considerations, such as kind of wind breaks and whether they have access to nearby running water, whether there's good sunlight or other aspects to that apiary. But some apiaries make really good spring and summer locations because they provide a lot of shade and they have a lot of nearby foraging resources and those kind of things. But in the winter, there's not really a lot of wind breaks. They can be really exposed, or being in the shade in the winter is actually more problematic than in the summer. And so a lot of times a good summer site is not a good winter site and vice versa. So you really need to think about your apiary location. And most of us prioritize convenience over everything else, our backyard or nothing else, right? And so you really might want to consider thinking about scoping out other places that might make better overwintering sites than what you currently have. And in doing so, moving your colonies kind of from summer yards to winter yards and back can really make a difference in your beekeeping success and your overwintering success. So, think about those locations and whether or not your apiary locations are really best for your bees, and not just for you and your convenience. One last thing that I'm going to underscore and kind of get on my soapbox again for a little bit, and that is keeping good records. As you go into winter, as you don't have as much to do during the winter as a beekeeper, this is when you want to go back to your records that you took all summer, learn from your mistakes, organize those records, make sure that your hives are well labeled and numbered, and so you know which hives are what. You have good notes on all of those. You have good Varroa mite data on all of your colonies, so that as you come out of winter and you have winter losses, you may be able to trace that back to different things that you did or didn't do the previous fall that you might be able to learn from. So record keeping is something that all beekeepers can do better at, everybody. And most beekeepers really have pretty appalling records, and they're really not very good at keeping track. They think, oh, I only have 1 or 2 hives, I'm going to remember it all. No, you really need to write these things down and be much more systematic about your management practices of each colony, because they're always going to be different. And in doing so, those subtle differences can result in dramatic changes in the outcomes of your colonies. And therefore, keeping track of that through your note-taking scheme is really the best way to do that. So again, I think hive placement and making sure that you have very good wind breaks and other considerations for winter apiary sites rather than summer sites. And if you don't have a very good winter apiary, then consider moving your hives to take advantage of different locations at different times of year that can really help your bees. And again, my mantra is that bad beekeeping and poor note-taking go hand in hand. And so the more notes that you take, the more information that you have about your bees, the better a beekeeper you will be, and the better your bees will be, especially come next spring. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to very briefly talk about some of the resources and some updates that we have here at NC State. You can check out our website at ncsuapiculture.net. But I just want to talk about some of the things, how you can keep apprised of some of the things that we have going on here at NC State. First and foremost, you can sign up on our email listserv for our Wolfpack Waggle newsletter. This is something that we publish quarterly and have recently updated the look of it. These are available on our website for download, but if you want to be notified for them, just sign up on our email listserv. And this goes over all the many of the different things that we have going on in our research, extension, and teaching programs. So it's a really good way to get an overview of the people that we have in the program and many of the things that we have going on. Another resource that we have is our Honeybee Queen and Disease Clinic. This is something that is spearheaded by our excellent genetics technician, Aaron McDermott, as well as a postdoc in our lab, Brad Netz. And together they help process different samples from beekeepers in order to assess the quality and the health of their colonies. And so this is something where we actually bring the scientific tools that we use for our research to bear for beekeepers so that they can get those same data, that same information that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. So Brad especially is the one who measures the queen reproductive quality to see how well mated queens are and presumably the different aspects of what makes them a good queen. And then Aaron on the genetics side does a lot of the pathogen screens and the pathogen analyses of viruses and other pathogens that make bees sick. And so for it's a feed-based structure where you can send in your samples and we can process them and give you in only a matter of days in most cases, give you a report back where we're able to ascertain whether, what are some potential problems in your bees or whether you get a clean bill of health. And so this is something that's very, very helpful for beekeepers and queen breeders especially. Now, another thing that we've been doing, and this is the Stanley County Beekeepers, this is a good example of this, is our new speaker request form. Because we have about 20 people in the program now, lots of people were going out and giving talks to different beekeeping groups, and it wasn't very well coordinated. So we've really tried to streamline that process of having this online request form where beekeepers can put in requests for speakers from NC State. And what we try to do is always service every single request, but we do so kind of in a descending order. We see if anybody is actually able to come out and present in person at that particular time. And we are trying to limit that to 2 talks per week so that we don't get kind of overly stretched and stretched too thin, because with 78 chapters in the state, meeting monthly, plus the bee schools, plus other opportunities, there's well over 1,200 different meetings every single year. And so it's really impossible to be able to get to all of them. But if the timing does match up, we will try to come out, and 2 of our members right now are out at different beekeeping clubs right now giving presentations. If we can't make an in-person presentation, we'll try and do a remote live webinar like we're doing right now, so that if the logistics don't work out to travel in person, then having these webinars and then inviting other groups to join simultaneously is another very helpful alternative to that. But if none of that works out, then we have a YouTube channel where some of our previously recorded webinars and other lecture series are free and posted on that YouTube channel. so that if we can't do these things live and in person, then at least you have the opportunity to having a speaker from NC State present at your meeting, even though it's recorded rather than live. So we try to accommodate as best we can, and hopefully all of the different requests that come in, they are going to be able to hear from somebody from NC State and in one of those forums. Now, another thing that we've been very busy in doing this past year is revamping our Bees Network. The Bees Network stands for Beekeeper Education and Engagement System. And these are a series of online beekeeping mini courses that we've had available since 2011 now, actually, is when this was really launched. It was launched by me individually, but since then we've kind of slowly built a team that's been able to really make a much better look and to revamp our entire curriculum so that it has a much more streamlined process and look to it now. So there are courses in 3 different tracks, those in biology, those beekeeping and bee management, and those in the honeybee industry. And then there are beginner level courses and there are advanced level courses. And so we're revamping these. They're all online. They can be taken either individually or they can be done in groups. And so if your local club doesn't already have a winter bee school and are interested in holding some sort of beekeeper training, these are resources that you may be able to tap into. And so contact us if you or your local extension agent may be interested in doing this. Another alternative that we hope to do this kind of late winter, early spring is to have a virtual beginner bee school. In essence, what that is not unlike this Zoom session like what we're having now. What we'll do is we'll have people enroll in these courses, have a week to watch the content in those courses, and then we'll have Zoom sessions once a week to be able to go over, to review, to ask questions, and discuss what they've learned in those courses so that it's asynchronous learning where people will learn individually, but then come together as a group and discuss and then learn from each other. So this is another thing that we hope to launch this next spring. I did this several years ago, actually 2 years in a row. But I hope now with the refreshed content and the updated offerings that we have, that we might have a lot more participation in it. So similar to the Bees Network, that is the Beekeeper Education and Engagement System, this past fall, we held our very first Bees Academies. So we actually had one in the mountains, one in the Piedmont, and one in the coast. This past fall that incorporated a lot of the new bees content into it, but it was alternated with live lectures and hands-on demonstrations and other activities. So it was really a mix of all of these different media and delivery mechanisms. And it was a real success. It was a profound success at each of these different locations. And so we hope to continue that positive momentum by having these intermediate trainings in the late summer and fall, right during that peak mite control season, so that we can get the most out of managing our bees at that time of year and then applying them so that they can go into winter as healthy as they can be. It's not necessarily a one-stop shop for the journeyman master beekeeper exam, but the hope is that those classes, the series of lectures in these academies, go a long way to preparing somebody for those journeyman tests. So I just want to acknowledge all the other people that are in the lab, the apiculture program right now. Again, it's by no means just me. It's a collective effort where we have around 20 different people in the program. And I want to give a shout out to all of them and for all of their hard work and all of their efforts. I'd like to open it up for any questions that you might have.
Dr. Tarpy.
Yes, sir.
Oh, we had a question about using granulated sugar instead of the fondant on the top.
The granulated sucrose is not something that the bees can really use. So it's something that you need to make it into a fondant or something harder that they're able to consume. Or there are other formulations of crystalline sugar that like a drivert sugar or inverted sugar that the bees can use, but just simple over-the-counter table sugar is not sufficient to provide them during the winter.
Tarpy.
Yes.
One of the folks wanted to know why you put it on top of the inner cover instead of on top of the frame.
Oh, you can put it on top of the frames. That picture that I showed just happened to be on the inner cover. You want it to be above the brood nest, however, so that it gets warm enough where they're able to manipulate it and to eat it. But you can put it on top of the frames, or you can put it on top of the inner cover. It's probably only going to be consumed if it gets kind of warm winter days where they're able to go outside the inner cover and access it. But that's, again, it's beekeeper choice, and it depends on how starving they really are during the winter. Hopefully you don't get to that point by making sure that they have sufficient honey stores going into winter.
Dr. Tarpy, when is it too cold to open your hives?
When is it too cold to open your hives? It's a great question. I think if you saw that that one table on when the bees tend to cluster, the temperatures at which they cluster, they stop foraging at 50 degrees, and the maximum cluster, its density is at about 14. I wouldn't go into the hives once it's below 40. It's really hard to say a specific number, but like once they're really tightly clustered, anything opening the hive and breaking those propolis seals can be really problematic. And it's hard for them to recover from that. And so, once it gets into the drops below kind of, into the 40s, you shouldn't be going into the colonies at all. I really like these thermal cameras too. They're getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. This one is one where it was taken with an iPhone filter. And so those kind of things can be really, really helpful, where you can check to see kind of how tightly clustered they are, if they're off to the side, if they've already moved up faster than you thought. It can really help you determine where that cluster is without having to open it. So it's something to think about. I have a text question here about those candy boxes at the bee shop. Look more like compacted sugar. Yeah, so it's like fondant. Yeah, I think I'm not quite as familiar with those. There's lots of different products out there that it's hard sometimes to keep up with them. But as long as it's not crystalline sucrose, I think that should be okay. If it's a fondant-like block of hardened candy, then that's something that they can consume. And again, those candy boards are really kind of a last resort, right? Ideally, you would never feed those things during the winter. You would make sure that they go into winter with enough honey. That's really the primary goal that every beekeeper should have, is to not feed during the winter, and you don't need to. If you find yourself doing that year in, year out, rethink how much honey you're taking off, during the summer, and consider keeping more on the bees.
Okay, we had a question about when you do your mite counts, That would be 6 bees in 200, or 6 mites in 200 bees, to get 3%. What kind of room of error is there in that? I mean, the likelihood of missing 2 bees or something. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so really the ideal, the best way to measure your bees is really out of 300 bees. So a half a cup is almost exactly 300 bees. So if you can take out a measuring cup, measuring out like, you know, flour when you're baking a cake, if you can get that precise and put that in, so really it's more like 9 mites for the 300 bees, right? That's your percentage. And if you're worried about kind of sampling error, then do it twice and see what kind of numbers you get between the two. Yes, you're going to have error. Now, it's not going to be 1% in one and then 20% in another, right? It's usually not that variable if you're doing it kind of consistently and doing it right. But sometimes you will have variation. So if you're right on that cusp, then maybe you take a second sugar shake just to make sure and that wasn't low, erroneously low for that one particular sugar shake.
On that same question, one of our beekeepers has mentioned that he's been told to do a second shake on the same bees. Do you recommend that?
So one of the things that I think a lot of beekeepers can use practice on is just exactly how hard to shake. You know, I see a lot of beekeepers just kind of tepidly shake it and jostle it, you know, shake it around like that. You really want to shake it pretty hard. You want to shake it where the bees are not going to be happy with you, right? Don't be you know, too tepid about shaking them out. So so I guess that's that second shake to make sure you got them all, you know, that kind of thing. So in that case, yes, I mean, it just make sure. In fact, there's an app available that you can get on your phone that kind of tells you if you're shaking it hard enough, right? So it's mimicking how hard you need to shake your phone like a sugar shake. And so get that app and kind of train yourself about how hard to shake out the mites from a sugar shake. There was a question on the chat line here about what was our percent loss of our bee yard in I'm assuming the NC State research apiaries. We're the worst example of beekeeping in the state. We give our bees diseases on purpose. We rob their queens. We don't treat them for mites so that we can study mites, right? We are the antithesis of good beekeeping practices on purpose so that we can learn of what goes wrong so we can tell you how to do it right. So our winter losses are usually, you know, kind of 50%. Well, Jennifer Keller, our wonderful apiculture technician who's in charge of all of our bees at NC State, she employs that age-old adage, take your winter losses in the fall, right? So Jennifer is constantly taking these beat up and, you know, sorry looking colonies that come out of these experiments that we do all summer, and she kind of puts them together and she unites them and she tries to take those losses in the fall by uniting weaker colonies together and not trying to, you know, to have these weak colonies limp through the winter, because that just ends up not working anyway. So she does a lot of combining and a lot of other kind of triage things in the fall. Yeah, but our winter losses are not very impressive as far as having high success rate. And it's because we're a research operation, not a beekeeping operation. There's another question here. Is there such a thing as being too late to treat for mites? So one thing that I'm trying to get away from is using the term treat, right, and trying to use control for mites. I think a lot of people have equated the term treat with using chemicals in order to kill the mites. And a lot of people are kind of philosophically opposed to doing that. But there are plenty of non-chemical control options for keeping the mite levels down, right? So as I like to say, treating for mites is optional, controlling for mites is not. It's just that using non-chemical controls just takes 2 or 3 times as much work to keep the mite levels at bay than it does with using some of those synthetic acaricides. So the answer to the question, though, is that it can be too late to control your mite levels. And probably right now, it's already too late. The winter bees that are going to make it through the winter and live for several months have already been raised pretty much everywhere here in the state. And so, controlling the mite levels for those winter bees should have been done, a month or 2 ago. And so that's really the critical period to make sure that there's not a lot of Varroa mites. Trying to control the Varroa mites right now isn't going to do a whole lot. It'll kill off those Varroa mites, but the damage has really already been done. So it depends on the time of year, it depends on the year, right, of when winter starts. This year it started a little bit earlier than traditionally, right? So it really just kind of depends on the seasonality of where you're located.